On the night of my son's graduation, I found my mom sitting on the service stairs of the auditorium with her cloth purse on her knees and her navy blue dress, the one she had bought at the downtown market 2 months earlier, the one she had ironed 3 times that week so it would be without a single wrinkle. My dad was standing next to her with his brown suit jacket on, the one he uses for important occasions, looking at his watch without saying anything. Inside, in the reception hall, 180 people were drinking wine and eating canapés on silver trays, while my son's name appeared on a massive screen in gold letters. My parents had been on those stairs for 40 minutes because someone had told them that the front row seats were for the immediate family and that they could go in to congratulate him when the protocol was over. When I understood who had given that instruction and why, I walked over to where my son was in his cap and gown, and I whispered something in his ear. He looked right at me, nodded, and together we did something that split that night in two in front of all the people who mattered in Chicago. But I haven't gotten to that part yet. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from. I like to know how far these stories reach. And if what we do here resonates with you, hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming. My name is Sarah Hayes. I'm 38 years old, and I've been an elementary school teacher at Lincoln Public on the South Side for 14 years. I teach 4th grade, fractions, spelling tests, American history, the multiplication tables that kids hate and that I swear to them they'll be grateful for when they grow up. My specialty is the kids nobody listens to because they speak too softly, and the ones nobody notices because they sit all the way in the back. 14 years teaching them that the place others assign them is not the place they belong. That certainty was taught to me by my parents long before I knew how to put it into words. And that exact same certainty was what I used on the night of November 16th at the Palmer House Convention Center, when everything I had kept quiet for 13 years stopped fitting inside me. I grew up on the South Side in a cinder block house without siding that my dad built in pieces as the money allowed. First, the living room and the kitchen, then 2 bedrooms, then the bathroom with a tin roof that sounded like a drum when it rained. I liked that sound. I used to fall asleep listening to it as a little girl, thinking someone was playing music outside. My mom used to tell me it was the sky letting us know it was going to water the plants because they needed it. That's how my mom was explaining things that didn't have a pretty explanation. She invented one for them. My dad, Frank Hayes, was a union mason for 37 years. 37 years mixing cement, carrying rebar, climbing scaffolding, with hands that couldn't quite close all the way since he turned 50. He built houses that later sold for millions in gated communities where they wouldn't have even let him walk through the front door. I know this because he told me once, without bitterness, just as a fact, the way he said difficult things as if talking about the weather. He only finished grade school, but he could read a blueprint better than any fresh out of college architect because he learned a blueprint with his hands before he learned it with his eyes. He retired on a pension that barely covers his blood pressure medication. His shoulders are rounded inward from so much heavy lifting. He's been walking slowly for 5 years now, but when he speaks, people turn to listen because he rarely speaks, and when he does, he's right. My mom, Mary Hayes, sewed other people's clothes for 30 years on a secondhand Singer machine she bought with the money she saved selling coffee from a thermos on the corner of the market for 6 months. She sewed on the dining room table because there was nowhere else. Pants, prom dresses, school uniforms, tablecloths for events. Ladies from the nice neighborhoods would arrive with fabrics that cost what my mom made in a week, asking her to make them something elegant and beautiful for Saturday. My mom would make them something elegant and beautiful for Thursday because that's how she was. She always delivered early, and she always delivered better than what they asked for. Her fingers have calluses on the sides of her index fingers from guiding the fabric under the presser foot for so long. When she sews without thinking, she hums old Patsy Cline songs she used to sing to my sister and me when we were little. Sometimes I listen to her and remember that there was a time when the world was so small it fit entirely on that dining room table with the singer machine humming. Between the two of them, they paid for my sister and me to study. My sister went to community college for nursing. I went to the state university for teaching. My mom kept the tuition bills in a manila envelope with my name written in black marker tucked inside the fridge behind the milk, because she said no one would find them there if we ever got robbed, and that the cold gave the bills a longer life. I don't know if the cold part is true, but that envelope never went missing. I met Richard Sterling at a wedding, a college friend's wedding at a banquet hall on the North Shore. I was 23. I was wearing a green dress I'd bought at Macy's with my first full teaching paycheck. It was the first expensive piece of clothing I'd ever bought, and I felt it. Richard was 28. He was an accountant at a logistics firm. He danced well. Too well for a man who didn't smile while he danced, as if dancing were a serious matter that required concentration. I thought it was funny. I told him he danced like something was hurting him. He laughed. That laugh was the beginning of everything. His family was one of the established families of Chicago. Not the absolute richest, but the kind that has spent 3 generations living in the same good neighborhood, with the same church, the same country club, and the same network of acquaintances that moves like an invisible fabric that no one sees but everyone feels. His dad, Arthur Sterling, was the manager of a distribution company founded by the grandfather, a bald man with a graying mustache who spoke in a low voice, forcing everyone else to lower theirs to hear him, as if attention were a scarce resource he managed. His mom, Eleanor Sterling, was the president of the Parish Women's Committee, an organizer of charity galas, and the kindest woman in the world, provided things went exactly the way she had decided they should go. Eleanor wasn't mean with a mean face. She was the kind who says something and makes you feel grateful she said it, even though that thing just left a small hole somewhere in your chest that you won't know how to name until years later. The first time I went to their house for dinner, a 2-story house in Winnetka with a garden and a 3-car garage, Eleanor asked me 4 questions in a row without pausing, like someone filling out a form. Where did I live? On the south side, I told her. She nodded. What did my dad do? Retired union mason. She nodded again. What did my mom do? Seamstress. 3rd nod. Where did I go to school? State University. 4th nod. That one just a little bit slower. When dinner was over, she told me that what I had achieved was very admirable, that not just any girl in my circumstances managed to get a degree. That Richard was a good boy, but she hoped I understood that marrying someone also meant marrying their family, and that required a certain adaptation. A certain adaptation. At 23, I took that phrase as well-meaning advice. At 38, I understand it was a warning, disguised as advice, which is the most dangerous thing in the world, because you can't defend yourself against it without looking rude. Richard told me later that his mom was like that with everyone at first, that deep down she was a really good person. She just needed time. That time. Always that time. Time that slips away without anything changing. We got married 2 years later. Eleanor organized almost the entire wedding. I picked the dress and the flowers for the tables. That's what they let me do. My mom wanted to embroider my initials on the handkerchief I was going to carry in my hand. Just something tiny. She told me, just so you carry a piece of me. Eleanor said the handkerchief was part of the dress ensemble and that embroidering something on it could alter the aesthetic of the look. My mom folded the thread, put the needle away and said it was fine, that it was no problem, that the important thing was for me to be happy. But I saw her hands putting that needle away, and I knew something else was put away with it. Something that wasn't just threat. When I was 26, Matthew was born, the first Sterling grandson. Eleanor poured herself into him with an intensity that seemed beautiful to me at first, and that over the years I began to understand differently. She bought him designer clothes, sent him toys out of catalogs, enrolled him in swimming lessons at the club when he was 4. And at the same time, at Sunday dinners, my parents would arrive, say hello, sit wherever there was space, and spend the afternoon watching their grandson from that polite distance that no one named, but we all knew existed. When Matthew turned 5, Eleanor hired a photographer to make him a birthday album. My parents are in 3 photos. Arthur and Eleanor are in 42. I know because I counted them one Sunday when I stumbled across the album by accident while looking for something else in the living room bookcase. A teacher counts even when she doesn't want to count. My parents didn't say anything. They got used to it, or they acted like they got used to it, which is a different thing that hurts more because it requires more effort. I didn't say anything either. I gave it time. 13 years of time. What I learned in those 13 years is that time doesn't fix things that someone has decided will always be crooked. Time just passes. Matthew's birthdays went by where my parents would arrive with handmade gifts and leave them on a separate table because the main gifts were already arranged on the center table with color-coordinated bows. The day passed when Matthew came home from school, repeating with no bad intentions a phrase he had heard at his paternal grandparents' house, that his maternal grandparents were very simple but very hardworking. Said with the exact same tone used to describe things you appreciate, but wouldn't display in your living room. I asked him who told him that. He said Grandma Eleanor, and that she had said it nicely. She had said it nicely. My 8-year-old son couldn't know yet that there are phrases that sound nice and do damage nicely, which is the worst possible combination. I didn't say anything to Richard. I learned over the years to file things away in a mental drawer and keep going. My parents had taught me that without meaning to keep going even if it hurts, to not make a scene, to not cause problems. I learned it so well that it took me 13 years to realize that not causing problems is not the same as not having problems. The problem existed. I had just learned not to see it. Matthew grew up serious curious, with my dad's clever hands and my mom's precision for doing things right the first time. When he was little, he loved going to my parents' house to watch his grandpa mix cement in the yard, because Frank would explain the proportions to him like it was math. He liked sitting next to my mom while she sewed and asking her to teach him straight stitches. My mom taught him. By the time Matthew was 12, he could sew a button better than most adults I know. At 16, he decided he wanted to study civil engineering. He told me in the kitchen one afternoon while we were doing homework together, him with his calculus notebook and me grading tests. Mom, I want to build bridges. Not highway bridges, pedestrian bridges. The ones people cross on foot. Grandpa Frank told me footbridges are the ones that matter most, because they're used by people who don't have cars. I sat there with my pencil in my hand, completely still for a moment. My 16-year-old son had understood something that 4 generations of Sterling architects and accountants had never understood. He went to Northwestern University for 5 years. He was the top student in his graduating class in structural engineering. I know this because his advisor told me at a progress meeting, and also because Matthew never told me himself, which is another way of knowing. Graduation day arrived, November 16th. Matthew woke up quiet, with that seriousness of his when something matters a lot to him, and he doesn't want it to show. I made him bacon and eggs for breakfast. My mom showed up at 8 in the morning with a bag of fresh pastries from the neighborhood bakery, the one that opens at 6, the one that smells like cinnamon from the street. My dad came in behind her with his brown suit jacket tucked into a plastic bag so it wouldn't wrinkle. His blue dotted tie rolled up in his hand. My dad wears that tie for the occasions that matter. He's had it for 20 years. My mom gave it to him for Father's Day, with money she saved by sewing 2 weeks of overtime. It's a normal tie, nothing fancy, but my dad ties the knot with a precision that makes it look like the most important thing in the world. We got to the Palmer house at 5 in the afternoon. The diploma ceremony had been at 3 in the main auditorium, and we all fit perfectly in there. My parents were sitting next to me in the center seats. My mom cried when they read Matthew's name out loud. My dad didn't cry. He clenched his jaw and stared straight ahead with that face he gets when he's holding something back that he's not going to let out because we're in public. When we left the auditorium, we took pictures outside with the hotel fountain in the background. Matthew between his 4 grandparents, the cap, the gown, the rolled-up diploma in his hand. My parents are smiling in those photos. My mom pulling the tassel on his cap so it was perfectly centered. My dad with his hand on Matthew's shoulder, looking at him the way you look at something that cost a lot and finally arrived. Those photos are in my living room. I put them in a large frame, the exact same day I printed them. At the reception hall, I was greeted by an event coordinator named Patricia, a woman with a professional voice and a catalog smile. I asked her for the seating chart because I have a teacher's habit. Before anything important starts, I check that everything is in order. Not out of distrust, out of discipline. She showed me the chart on her tablet. Matthew in the center, Richard to his right, me to his left, Arthur and Eleanor next to Richard. On my side, an aunt of Richard's I barely knew, and Matthew's godfather, who was Richard's best friend from college. I scanned the chart looking for my parents. They weren't at the head table. They weren't at the second table. I kept searching table by table. Mary and Frank Hayes were not assigned to any seat. I asked Patricia. She took a second. The second of someone who doesn't want to say what they have to say. She explained that Mrs. Sterling had called the afternoon before to make an adjustment to the seating arrangement. She had indicated that Mrs. Hayes' parents, that's how she said it, Mrs. Hayes' parents, would prefer to sit in the waiting area out in the hallway because they would feel more comfortable in a less formal environment. That it was their idea, because they weren't used to events of this type, that they weren't used to it. I laughed, not out of joy. I laughed that laugh that comes out when the body doesn't know what else to do with something too massive to process all at once. I told Patricia I needed a moment. I walked out a side door into the service hallway. That hallway that smells like industrial detergent and hot food, where the walls don't have the finish of the main ballroom because nobody who matters walks through there. And there they were. My mom sitting on the stairs with her cloth purse on her lap and her navy blue dress, the one she had ironed 3 times. My dad standing next to her with his brown suit jacket and his blue dotted tie, looking at his watch. When they saw me, they both stood up at the exact same time, as if they'd been caught doing something they shouldn't. My mom said in that voice of hers that has no edge even when she has every reason to have one, "Honey, Eleanor said we'd be quieter out here while the protocol finished up, that they'd let us know when to come in. She said there are a lot of important people inside and that this was easier for everyone." She said it without resentment. She said it believing it was a courtesy. My dad looked at her, not at me, and said, "It's fine, sweetheart. They'll tell us in a minute." My dad, 64 years old, with shoulders permanently bent inward from 37 years of heavy lifting, with his 20-year-old tie perfectly knotted, waiting in a service hallway on the night of his only grandson's graduation because someone had decided he was more comfortable there. "No," I said loudly. "I have 14 years as a teacher. 14 years learning that when something spirals out of control, the first thing you do isn't react. The first thing you do is understand what happened so you can fix it right." I told them it was fine, thank you very much, and that in just a minute we were all going into the ballroom together. My mom smiled. My dad tugged at his tie to center it. I walked back out the way I came. I leaned against the hallway wall. I needed to feel something solid while my brain sorted things into columns, like when I grade exams and have to separate what can be salvaged from what can't. I went looking for Richard. I found him in the ballroom talking to two co-workers with a drink in his hand. I asked him to step outside for a moment. He stepped out with the expression of someone who doesn't understand the urgency. I asked him if he knew my parents were waiting in the service hallway because his mother had said they'd be more comfortable there. His face changed. That sideways downward glance people do when you catch them in something they can't deny, but don't want to confirm either. He told me his mom had mentioned something to him that morning, that she thought my parents would feel out of place at the head table with all the university deans and Matthew's classmates and their families, that it was out of consideration, that there was no bad intention. Out of consideration. That word that has spent 13 years showing up under different names, every time someone decides for my parents what's best for them, without asking them a damn thing. I asked him if he had approved it. He said he found out that afternoon when it was already done, but that he didn't think it was that big of a deal because at the end of the day, my parents were there. It wasn't like they weren't invited. Yes, they were there, in the hallway, in their party dress and their important occasion shoes, waiting for someone to tell them they were allowed to come in. I didn't answer him. I walked into the ballroom toward Eleanor. She was at the head table with her friends from the charity committee, with her glass of rosé and the pearl necklace she wears for events. When she saw me coming, she didn't move from her chair. She motioned with her hand for me to come closer. Slowly, like someone calling a person who has plenty of time. I asked her straight out if she had given the order for my parents to wait in the hallway. She told me it hadn't been an order, that it had been a suggestion, that Patricia had misunderstood, that she had merely said that perhaps my parents would feel more at ease in a less crowded space because they weren't familiar with these types of events. Weren't familiar. Then she dropped the phrase that had been said in different ways for 13 years, and that tonight she finally said in full. She said, "Sarah, let's be realistic. This is Matthew's graduation from Northwestern. The deans are here, the professors, his classmates from the entire program, and their families. Your parents are very good people, nobody doubts that. But they themselves know that in certain environments, they feel uncomfortable. Don't put them in a situation they won't be able to handle. It's for their own good." It's for their own good. She was talking about my mom, a woman who had taught herself to read sewing patterns in French because a client had brought her a European fashion magazine, and she had decided that if there was work there, she was going to learn how to do it. She was talking about my dad, a man who had built with his bare hands the walls of the gated communities that Matthew's college buddies called when their parents needed remodeling. This woman was talking about them as if they were fragile things that needed to be protected from themselves. One of her friends lowered her eyes to her glass. Another cleared her throat. Eleanor looked at me, waiting for me to say yes, that she was right, that it was for everyone's own good. I told her, "I'm going to get my parents." I turned around, I walked into the main ballroom. Matthew was with a group of classmates still in his gown, diploma in hand, laughing about something. I saw him scan the room looking for his grandparents, and I saw his face do that thing it does when he's processing something that doesn't add up. He knows me too well. He knew something was wrong. He walked toward me before I could reach him. He asked me where his grandparents were. That's what he calls them, his grandparents. No last name. As if that were their full title and they didn't need another one. I said they're in the hallway, honey. He looked at me. He didn't ask why. He looked at me for a long time with that seriousness of his when he's running the numbers. And he said, "Why are they in the hallway, Mom?" I didn't answer him. I asked him, "What do you want to do?" He told me without hesitating, without lowering his voice, "I want them here." I told him, "Then go get them." I didn't give him a script. I didn't explain what he had to say. He was 22 years old, he was an engineer, and he was the guest of honor tonight. And if he wanted his grandparents in the ballroom, he could go get them. Matthew walked down the hallway. I saw him push through the doors and disappear. I stood in the middle of the room waiting. Richard came over and asked me what was going on. I told him Matthew had gone to get my parents. He told me there was no need to make a scene. I told him nobody was making a scene, that a grandson was going to get his grandparents to bring them to his graduation. That wasn't a scene. That was the bare minimum. Matthew came back into the ballroom through the main doors, with my mom on his right and my dad on his left. The three of them together. Slowly, because my dad walks slowly. Matthew had one hand on my mom's arm and the other on my dad's shoulder. When they walked into the room, the murmur of conversations didn't stop. People kept talking, drinking, moving. But Matthew walked straight to the head table and asked the event coordinator for the microphone. The coordinator looked at him. He was the graduate. He handed him the mic. Matthew took a breath, looked at the room. He had the voice he uses when he's serious, which sounds more like my dad than any Sterling I've ever met. He said, "Good evening, everyone. I want to thank my graduating class, my professors, and my family for being here tonight. There is something I want to say before we continue." The volume in the room slowly dropped, like when the lights dim and your eyes take a second to adjust. Eleanor set her glass on the table. Arthur shifted in his chair. Richard looked for me from across the room. I held his gaze. Matthew said, "I am a civil engineer because two people taught me to understand how things are built. My grandpa Frank explained the proportions of cement to me when I was 6 years old, and he told me that a poorly made mix collapses, and what collapses can hurt people. My grandma Mary taught me how to sew a button, and she told me the important thing about sewing isn't that it looks pretty, but that it holds." He paused. Tonight, I went looking for them to take my graduation photos, and I found them waiting in a hallway because someone thought they'd be more comfortable there. I want everyone in this room to know that wasn't right. And I want my grandparents to know that the place they belong tonight is right here at this table with me. The silence in the Palmer House reception hall was the silence that falls when 200 people simultaneously process something they didn't expect to hear. Eleanor brought a hand to her necklace. Arthur lowered his head very slowly. A university dean sitting at the head table nodded exactly once, looking at Matthew. I walked up to where he was. I took the microphone from him carefully, the way you take something heavy but necessary to hold tight. And I told the room that I appreciated their presence, that the evening would continue for anyone who wanted to stay, and that I apologized to anyone this might have made uncomfortable, because it wasn't my son's intention to cause a scene, but to name something that needed to be named. I handed the microphone back to the coordinator. I walked over to the table where Richard was standing. I told him quietly that tonight, in the car ride home, We were going to have a conversation we should have had many years ago. And depending on how that conversation went, there were going to be things to decide. I didn't give him options in that moment. I gave him time to think. That time that sometimes actually helps. I went to the head table with my parents. I asked Patricia, the coordinator, to put 2 chairs next to me. She placed them without asking any questions with an efficiency I thanked her for, without saying a word. My mom sat on my right with her cloth purse on her lap. My dad sat to my mom's left and tucked his tie to center it. That same gesture as always. Matthew sat across from them. They served dinner. Eleanor stayed at her table and didn't look our way the entire night. Arthur, on the other hand, stood up 20 minutes later, walked over to where we were, and held his hand out to my dad. My dad took it. They didn't say anything. Sometimes a handshake says what neither of the two knows how to say with words. In the car on the way back, Matthew rode up front with me, and my parents were in the back. My mom was rubbing the sleeve of my dad's suit jacket the way she does when she's happy and doesn't quite know how to say it. My dad was looking out the window with that face he gets when he's keeping something inside so he doesn't let it out in public. Out of nowhere, my mom said, "Matthew, did you eat enough? It looked like they served you a tiny portion." Matthew said, "Yeah, I ate. Grandma, it was good." My mom said, "Next Sunday, I'm making beef stew." Matthew said, "I'll bring the parsley." My dad said, without turning from the window, "I'll bring the crusty bread." And that was it, just like that, as if nothing had happened, and at the same time, as if everything had happened. The conversation with Richard that night was long. I'm not going to tell the whole thing because there are parts that belong only to him and me. What I will say is that it was the first time in 13 years that we talked without me filing something away in my mental drawer to avoid causing problems. I told him everything I had kept hidden. I told him about the birthday photos, about the handkerchief for my wedding dress, about the trip his parents had given Matthew to Florida when he was 10, which my parents didn't go on because they didn't fit the plans. About the comment his mom made to Matthew that my parents were very simple but very hardworking, said in the voice you use to describe something you appreciate from a distance. Richard listened. He didn't defend himself. That told me more than anything he could have said. In the end, he told me I was right, that he had seen things and stayed quiet because it was easier, that he had no excuse for that. I told him I knew, and that what mattered now wasn't what had happened, but what was going to happen. I asked him if he was willing to have a conversation with his mother, a real conversation, not a polite one where he told her that things were going to be different from now on. He told me yes. I don't know if he said it believing it or wanting to believe it, which is different. But he said it. And sometimes the first step is saying it, even if you don't know how to do it yet. That conversation with Eleanor happened a week later. I wasn't there. Richard went alone. What he told me is that his mother listened without interrupting, which was already a departure from the usual. At the end, she told him she had never intended to hurt anyone, and if that's what happened, she was sorry. It wasn't a full-worded apology. It was the closest to an apology that Eleanor could ever get. And Richard told me exactly like that, without sugarcoating it. I told him I heard him. Eleanor didn't change her personality overnight. People like her don't just change like that. But something settled differently after that night at the Palmer house. Something I can't name exactly, but that you can feel in the way she now greets my parents before moving on to the rest of the greetings when we arrive at her house. It's small, but it's different from what was there before. Arthur called me a month later. He told me he wanted to apologize to me directly, without middleman. He told me he had been present for 13 years and had stayed quiet because that's how things were in his house. and it had never occurred to him that things could be any different. He told me that was no excuse, but he wanted me to know. I thanked him. I told him the past was already written, and what mattered was what came next. He asked me if Matthew could come visit them. I told him that was a question he had to ask Matthew. Matthew went. He came back saying Grandpa Arthur had asked him about his thesis projects and had listened to him talk for 40 minutes about pedestrian bridges without interrupting him. He said it like it was something remarkable. To him, it was. I'm still a teacher at Lincoln Elementary. I still teach 4th grade fractions, spelling tests, multiplication tables. Matthew is doing his internship at a construction firm in Chicago, and on weekends he goes to see my parents. My dad is teaching him how to read blueprints by hand without a computer, because he says if you don't know how to read a blueprint by hand, you don't truly understand what you're looking at on a screen. Matthew takes a notebook to those visits and writes everything down. My mom watches them from the kitchen, and sometimes she sends me a picture on WhatsApp. Just the picture, no text. Just the image of the two of them at the table with the blueprint spread out and my dad's hands pointing at something. That's all I need to know. Sometimes I think, what would have happened if I hadn't asked Patricia for the seating chart that night? If I had stayed in the ballroom, assuming my parents were already settled somewhere. If I had danced and toasted and clapped and sent beautiful photos that night, and my parents had left the Palmer house in silence, in their good clothes and their important occasion shoes, without anyone telling them that their place was the same as always, next to their grandson, at the table where it mattered to be. That alternate universe Sarah would have kept carrying a tiny weight in her chest that only gets heavier with the years. There would have been Matthew's wedding someday, and a baptism, and another graduation. And at every single one, my parents would have been pushed a little further to the back and a little less in the photos. And nobody would have said anything, because that's just how things were. That's how things are, until someone says no. I learned that night. And I learned it from my son, who is 22 years old and already knows what took me 13 years to learn, that people's places aren't decided by whoever organizes the event. They're decided by whoever loves them. I'm not telling this so anyone does what I did. Every family is its own universe. Every story has its reasons, its fears, its complications, that you can't see from the outside. I'm telling it because I know someone is listening to me right now who has their mom waiting in the hallway with her good dress on, who has their dad checking his watch outside the room where his grandson is inside being celebrated, who has spent years hearing phrases like, they'll feel more comfortable, it's for their own good, they prefer it this way themselves. It's not for their own good. It's never for their own good. It's for the good of whoever decides who gets in and who stays out. My mom made beef stew the following Sunday. Matthew brought the parsley like he promised. My dad arrived with crusty bread from the market and sat in his usual spot at the kitchen table. My mom served it in 4 mismatched bowls. My dad's was large, Matthew's was medium, hers was small, mine was the usual size. We ate, the 4 of us, under the yellow light of the kitchen with a Singer machine in the corner and the smell of roasted meat and gravy filling the house. Matthew got seconds. My dad said my mom's stew was the best in the world, just like he said every Sunday for 40 years. My mom told him not to exaggerate. My dad said he wasn't exaggerating. And at some point during that same old argument, with my spoon in my hand and the steam from the stew in my face, I understood that this was what we had gone looking for that night at the Palmer house without knowing we were looking for it. Not public justice, not the speech, not the silence of the ballroom. This, the table where everyone fits, the yellow light, the same old stew, and nobody telling you that you don't belong. If this story touched something inside you, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments which part hit you the hardest. If you also have a mom or a dad who deserved a chair and was left standing in a hallway, write it down. Every message gets read here. And if you want more stories like this, hit the bell. I'll be waiting for you here. One quick note before we go. This story was built and dramatized with the help of artificial intelligence, with the goal of entertaining you and leaving you with something real to take home. Because even though the story is fiction, the love it describes is not. The place of the people we love isn't decided by who sets the tables or who prints the seating charts. It's decided by who loves them. Sarah took 13 years to say it out loud, but when she did, she said it with absolute clarity. If you have someone waiting in a hallway today in their good clothes, you still have time to go get them. This story resonates deeply because it holds up a mirror to the quiet, invisible barriers we sometimes allow others to build around the people we love. We often confuse polite exclusion with genuine consideration, accepting excuses that wrap prejudice in an elegant smile. What moves me most is not just the grand gesture in the ballroom, but the profound realization that true dignity doesn't come from a tailored suit or an exclusive zip code. Dignity is forged in the calloused hands of a father mixing cement and the tired, precise fingers of a mother sewing late into the night. The greatest lesson we can pull from this is the courage to stop making ourselves small just to keep the peace in rooms where we are barely tolerated. We must actively choose to bring our loved ones out of the metaphorical hallways of our lives and give them the front row seats they have rightfully earned. It is incredibly easy to fall into the trap of letting society dictate the worth of our family based on their grammar, their jobs, or their lack of formal education. Yet true wisdom, the kind that the young engineer displayed, recognizes that the strongest foundations are built by those who know how to weather life's hardest storms. Applying this to our own lives means taking a hard look at where we might be compromising our values to fit into spaces that don't truly welcome all of who we are. It means finding your voice, even if it takes years to gently but firmly say no to the subtle snobbery that chips away at human worth. We learn today that love is not just a feeling, it is an action, a boundary drawn, and a chair proudly pulled up to the main table. Let this be the moment you promise yourself to never let the people who sacrificed for you be treated like an embarrassing inconvenience. Honor the simplicity of your roots, because those roots are exactly what gave you the strength to grow so tall. The most beautiful table you will ever sit at isn't covered in silver platters, but illuminated by the warm, honest light of unapologetic belonging. Ultimately, your worth and the worth of those who raised you is never decided by the person making the seating chart, but by the fierce, unwavering love you show them. Please remember that the narrative we just explored is shared strictly for educational and inspirational purposes, crafted to spark meaningful reflections on empathy, class, and family values. The commentary and personal perspectives provided are intended solely to encourage positive personal growth and human connection. This content does not substitute for professional relationship, psychological, or familial counseling. Every family dynamic is unique, and listeners are encouraged to navigate their own personal situations with care, using these reflections as a gentle guide rather than absolute instruction.